You felt it before, that quiet moment when the alarm goes off and your body refuses to move. You lie there, half awake, bargaining with yourself, promising you'll start tomorrow. But what if that single decision right there in the dark is the reason your life hasn't changed yet? Somewhere in the world, someone woke up at 5 a.m. today and took control before the day could control them. Not because they felt ready, not because they had more energy, but because they understood something most people never learn. The morning is where power is decided. Most people think success begins with big moves, bold risks, and major breakthroughs, but it doesn't. It begins in silence, in stillness, in a small unseen decision made before the sun rises. And that decision is either strengthening you or slowly weakening you. There is a hidden pattern behind laziness that almost no one talks about. It's not that you don't want more. It's not that you lack ambition. It's that your mind has been conditioned to choose comfort at the exact moment action is required, and it happens faster than you realize. Every time you hit snooze, you're not just delaying your morning. You're reinforcing a habit, a pattern, a version of yourself that avoids pressure, avoids growth, avoids becoming something greater. And over time, that pattern becomes your identity. But here's what changes everything. The moment you interrupt that pattern even once, your mind begins to shift. It realizes that you are no longer predictable, that you are no longer controlled by habit. And that's where real transformation begins. At 5 a.m., there's no audience, no noise, no distractions pulling your attention in every direction. It's just you and your thoughts, raw, unfiltered, honest. And in that space, you are forced to confront who you are and who you've been avoiding becoming. That's why this hour is so powerful. Not because of the time itself, but because of what it demands from you. It asks you to move when you don't feel like it, to act when there is no pressure, to become disciplined without being watched. And most people fail right here, not because they can't wake up early, but because they don't understand what they're really fighting. They think it's sleep. It's not. It's the part of them that has grown comfortable staying exactly where they are. There is a version of you that already exists, the one who wakes up early, moves with purpose, and takes control of their day before anything can interfere. But that version is locked behind a simple gate, a decision made in a matter of seconds. And here's the truth that most people avoid. Every morning, you are either stepping closer to that version of yourself or you are stepping further away. There is no neutral, no pause, no waiting, only progress or slow, invisible decline. But what if waking up early didn't feel like a battle? What if there was a way to condition your mind so that getting up becomes natural, almost automatic? A way to remove the resistance that keeps pulling you back into the same cycle? Because there is a method, a specific sequence that changes how you respond the moment your eyes open. It doesn't rely on motivation. It doesn't depend on willpower alone. It rewires the way your mind reacts to effort itself. The people who rise early and dominate their days aren't stronger than you. They aren't more gifted. They've simply trained themselves differently. They've learned how to act before doubt has time to speak, before comfort has time to negotiate. And once you understand this, everything shifts. You stop seeing mornings as something to survive and start seeing them as something to use, a weapon, a tool, a daily opportunity to gain an advantage most people willingly give away, because while others are sleeping, delaying, drifting, you're building momentum, and momentum is dangerous. It compounds, it grows. It starts small, almost invisible, but over time, it becomes something that can't be stopped. The first morning will be difficult. The second will challenge you. But somewhere along the way, something clicks. You begin to feel a quiet confidence, a sense that you are no longer at the mercy of your habits, but in control of them. And that feeling spreads into your work, your decisions, your standards. You begin to expect more from yourself, and naturally, you start getting more. Not because the world changed, but because you did. So the real question isn't whether you can wake up at 5 a.m., it's whether you're ready to let go of the version of yourself that keeps choosing comfort over growth. Because both cannot exist at the same time. What you're about to hear is not just a routine, it's a shift in identity. A way to train your mind to act without hesitation, to move without excuses, and to build a life that no longer depends on how you feel in the moment. Follow it closely, and the next time your alarm goes off, you won't hesitate. You won't negotiate. You'll move. And in that single decision, you may finally begin to understand what it means to truly take control of your life. There is a moment each morning that passes quickly, yet it holds more power than most men ever come to understand. It does not last long. It does not announce itself. It appears quietly when the alarm sounds and the body remains still. In that moment, a decision is made, not loudly, not consciously in full, but decisively. If I were to begin again, I would give this moment my full attention. For it is not merely the beginning of a day, it is the continuation of a pattern. And that pattern, repeated, becomes the life a man eventually lives. Most men believe that laziness is a condition, something fixed, something inherited, yet this is not so. Laziness is not a trait, it is a sequence, a repeated decision, made at the same moment, each morning, until it becomes automatic. If I were beginning again, I would not attempt to change my entire day. I would change this moment. For in this moment, direction is chosen. There is a process that occurs almost instantly. The alarm sounds. The mind becomes aware. And before full consciousness arrives, a suggestion appears. Remain, delay, begin later. This suggestion does not feel like weakness. It feels reasonable, comfortable, and because it is familiar, it is accepted. If I were beginning again, I would recognize this suggestion immediately, for it is not harmless. It is the beginning of surrender. There is also the matter of speed. This decision is not made after long thought. It is made quickly, before reasoning fully develops, before intention has time to strengthen. Thus, the man who delays does not do so after careful consideration. He does so because he has been conditioned to respond in this way. If I were beginning again, I would interrupt this speed, not by thinking more, but by acting sooner. There is also the illusion that this moment is insignificant. A man may say, "It is only a few minutes. It makes little difference." Yet this is error, For it is not the minutes that matter, it is the pattern. Each time a man remains, he strengthens the habit of delay. And what is strengthened becomes easier, more natural, more automatic. If I were beginning again, I would not measure this moment by time. I would measure it by influence. There are many who remain in this pattern for years. They rise slowly. They begin without urgency. They move without direction. And over time, this becomes their condition. Not because they lack desire, but because they have trained themselves to delay at the moment action is required. If I were beginning again, I would not allow this training to continue. I would replace it. There is also another man, one who hears the same alarm, feels the same resistance, yet acts, not because he feels ready, not because he is, without discomfort, but because he has decided that action will occur without negotiation. This man appears different, not in ability, but in response. He moves immediately, and in that movement, something begins to form, control. If I were beginning again, I would become this man, not through force, but through repetition. There is also a strengthening that occurs each time action is taken immediately. At first, it is difficult. The body resists. The mind suggests delay. Yet if the man moves regardless, he proves something to himself, that he is not controlled by comfort, that he directs his own action. If I were beginning again, I would build this proof, morning after morning. There is also a weakening that occurs when delay is chosen. A man remains, he justifies it, he explains it, yet something is lost, not visible, but internal. His authority weakens, his command becomes less firm, and in time he begins to expect delay. If I were beginning again, I would not allow this weakening, for expectation determines future action. There is also the concept of identity within this moment. A man who rises immediately becomes one who acts. A man who delays becomes one who hesitates. This identity is not formed through declaration. It is formed through repetition. If I were beginning again, I would shape this identity deliberately through action. There is also the perception of others. A man who acts immediately carries himself differently. He speaks with certainty. He moves with direction. Others notice this. They recognize decisiveness. They associate it with capability. And in this, they respond differently. If I were beginning again, I would not seek to appear disciplined. I would become decisive, for appearance follows condition. There is also the compounding effect. One morning of action produces little visible change, but many mornings produce transformation. The man begins to move differently, to think differently, to expect more of himself, and in this his life begins to shift. If I were beginning again, I would trust this accumulation, for it is gradual, yet certain. There is also a final realization. The battle of the day is not fought in many moments. It is fought in one, at the beginning, before the world interferes, before distraction appears, before comfort settles. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, move at once, do not remain. Let this be fixed firmly within. I rise immediately, I do not delay. I act the moment action is required. Repeat this not as encouragement, but as command. For the mind, when trained to act quickly, reduces hesitation. And when hesitation is reduced, control is established. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, I would begin here, at the sound of the alarm. For in that single moment I would decide not only how I begin my day, but how I shape my condition, through repeated action applied without delay until rising becomes natural. And hesitation is no longer part of who I am. Having understood that the decisive moment occurs when the alarm sounds, the next principle, if I were to begin again, is to recognize that this moment is not created in the morning, it is prepared the night before. For a man does not act only according to what he decides in the moment. He acts according to what he has already accepted. And what he has accepted most recently carries the greatest influence. If I were beginning again, I would not attempt to conquer the morning upon waking. I would conquer it before sleep. There is a condition that forms each evening. The body slows, the mind quiets, and the resistance that governs thought during the petitions. Day begins to weaken. In this state, suggestion is accepted more readily, not because the man is convinced, but because he is no longer resisting. If I were beginning again, I would use this condition deliberately, for it is here that instruction becomes effective. Most men enter sleep without direction. They carry into it fragments of the day, unfinished thoughts, unclear intention. They do not decide how they will rise. They leave it to chance. And in doing so, they surrender control before the morning arrives. If I were beginning again, I would not allow chance to determine my action. I would decide clearly before sleep. There is also the principle of final impression. The last thought carried into rest does not fade. It continues. It is repeated. It becomes the dominant suggestion that influences the first action of the day. If that thought is uncertain, the morning is uncertain. If it is directed, the morning is directed. If I were beginning again, I would guard this final impression with care. There is also the matter of repetition. A single decision made once carries little influence, but a decision repeated night after night becomes instruction. The mind begins to expect it, and what is expected is acted upon more easily. If I were beginning again, I would not decide once. I would decide repeatedly until it becomes natural. There is also a transformation that occurs through this practice. At first, the man must remind himself. He must speak inwardly with intention. He must say, I rise at once, yet he may not fully believe it. This is natural, for belief follows repetition, not the reverse. If I were beginning again, I would continue despite this, for repetition reduces resistance. There is also the connection between clarity and action. A vague intention produces a weak response. A clear instruction produces a direct one. A man must not say, I will try to wake early. He must say, I rise at the first sound. If I were beginning again, I would make my instruction definite, without uncertainty. There is also the influence of expectation. A man who prepares his mind before sleep begins to expect action. He no longer wakes in confusion. he wakes with direction already established, and in this, hesitation is reduced. If I were beginning again, I would build this expectation deliberately through nightly repetition. There is also the effect upon the moment of waking. The alarm sounds, the body resists, yet the mind has already been instructed. It recognizes the command, and in this recognition, action becomes easier, not effortless, but less resisted. If I were beginning again, I would rely upon this preparation, for it shortens the struggle. There is also a visible difference between men who prepare and those who do not. One awakens uncertain. He negotiates. He delays. The other awakens. Directed. He moves, not because he feels different, but because he has conditioned himself. If I were beginning again, I would become the latter through preparation. There is also the example of men who have understood this principle. Benjamin Franklin did not leave his mornings to chance. He began with intention. He prepared his mind. And in doing so, he created order in his actions. His mornings were not accidental. They were directed. If I were beginning again, I would follow this understanding. There is also the compounding effect. Each night of preparation strengthens the next morning. Each repetition builds familiarity until the action no longer feels forced. Expected. If I were beginning again, I would trust this process, for it builds quietly yet powerfully. There is also the removal of uncertainty. A man who does not prepare must decide each morning, and decision, when repeated daily, creates hesitation. But a man who has already decided removes this burden. He does not ask, he acts. If I were beginning again, I would remove decision from the morning and place it in the night. There is also a final realization. The morning does not determine the man. The preparation does. A man who prepares rises. A man who does not prepares to delay. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, decide before sleep and act without question. Let this be fixed firmly within. I prepare my mind. I rise according to my decision. I act as I have instructed myself. Repeat this not as encouragement, but as preparation, for the mind, when instructed before rest, follows more readily upon waking, and when it follows, action becomes immediate. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, having mastered the moment of decision, I would do this next. I would prepare each night without fail until the morning no longer presents a struggle, but a response to a command already given and accepted, before sleep ever began, guiding me into action. The moment my eyes open, without hesitation and without delay. Having prepared the mind before sleep, the next principle, if I were to begin again, is to understand what truly stands between a man and action in the morning. It is not sleep. It is not fatigue. It is comfort. More precisely, it is the reflex toward comfort. A conditioned response. Immediate. Automatic. Unquestioned. If I were beginning again, I would not attempt to overcome tiredness. I would break this reflex, for it is the reflex, not the condition, that holds the man in place. There is a moment upon waking when the body seeks to remain. It seeks warmth, stillness, ease. This is natural. Yet what is natural is not always beneficial, and when followed without question, it becomes limiting. If I were beginning again, I would not obey what feels natural. I would examine it. There is also the speed of this response. The alarm sounds. Before thought fully forms, the body resists. The mind suggests remaining, and the man follows, not because he has decided carefully, but because he has been conditioned to respond in this way. If I were beginning again, I would interrupt this pattern, not by thinking longer, but by acting sooner. There is also the reinforcement of this reflex. Each time a man remains in comfort, he strengthens the response. He teaches himself that ease is to be followed, that resistance is to be avoided, and in doing so, he builds a habit, not of rest, but of avoidance. If I were beginning again, I would not allow this reinforcement, for what is repeated becomes automatic. There are many who believe they lack discipline, yet what they lack is interruption. They have never broken the pattern. They have never acted against the reflex. And so it remains, strong, unchallenged. If I were beginning again, I would challenge it immediately. There is also the first act of defiance. The man rises despite discomfort. He moves despite resistance. This act appears small, yet it carries weight. For in that moment, he proves something, that he is not controlled by impulse, that he can act beyond what he feels. If I were beginning again, I would value this act, for it begins transformation. There is also a resistance that will follow. The body will resist again. The mind will suggest again. Yet if the man continues, if he rises again the next morning, and the next the reflex weakens, it no longer commands, it merely suggests. And suggestion, when not followed, loses power. If I were beginning again, I would persist through this stage, for it is temporary. There is also a visible shift. At first, rising feels forced. The man must exert effort, but over time, something changes. The resistance lessens. The body responds more quickly. The act becomes easier, not because the man has changed his condition, but because he has changed his response. If I were beginning again, I would continue until this stage is reached. There is also the effect upon identity. A man who obeys comfort becomes one who avoids effort. A man who ignores comfort becomes one who acts. This identity forms quietly, through repetition, through daily response. If I were beginning again, I would shape this identity deliberately, through refusal. There is also the perception of others. A man who rises despite discomfort carries himself differently. He does not appear hesitant. He does not delay. Unnecessarily, others observe this. They recognize strength not in appearance, but in action, and they respond accordingly. If I were beginning again, I would not seek admiration. I would build control, for control produces respect naturally. There is also the expansion of this principle beyond the morning. A man who breaks the comfort reflex upon waking begins to apply it elsewhere. He acts when effort is required. He proceeds when resistance appears. He no longer avoids. And in this, his entire condition begins to shift. If I were beginning again, I would understand this clearly, that the morning is only the beginning. There is also the compounding effect. Each act of defiance strengthens the next. Each refusal weakens the reflex further, until eventually the reflex no longer governs behavior. It fades, and in its place, action remains. If I were beginning again, I would trust this accumulation, for it is gradual yet certain. There is also the example of men who have applied this principle. Those who rose early to begin their work did not do so because they felt inclined. They did so because they had trained themselves to act regardless. Their strength was not natural. It was formed through repetition, through refusal to obey comfort. If I were beginning again, I would follow this understanding. There is also a final realization. Comfort is not the enemy, but obedience to comfort is. A man may feel resistance. He may feel the desire to remain, yet he is not required to. Follow it. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, do not obey the first impulse. Act beyond it. Let this be fixed firmly within. I do not follow comfort. I act despite resistance. I move when action is required. Repeat this not as encouragement, but as command. For the mind, when trained to act beyond impulse, gains control. And when control is gained, laziness loses its foundation. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, having prepared my mind before sleep, I would do this next. I would break the reflex each morning, without exception, until what once held me still no longer governs me, and what once felt difficult becomes natural. As I rise, not because I feel ready, but because I have decided, and I act accordingly, without delay and without surrender to the comfort that once controlled me. Having broken the reflex of comfort, the next principle, if I were to begin again, is to understand that rising alone is not sufficient. A man may rise early and still remain unchanged, for it is not the hour that produces power, it is what is done within it. The first hour of the day carries a peculiar influence. It does not merely begin the day, it shapes it. It establishes direction. It sets pace, and what is set early tends to continue. If I were beginning again, I would not waste this hour, for it determines more than most men realize. There is a condition that forms immediately upon waking. The mind is clear, uncluttered, not yet filled with the demands of the world. In this state, thought is more direct, action is less resisted, and direction may be established with greater ease. If I were beginning again, I would use this condition deliberately, before it is disturbed. There is also the danger of slow beginning. A man rises yet delays. He moves without purpose. He drifts. And in doing so, he weakens the very advantage he has gained. The early hour is lost, not through sleep, but through lack of direction. If I were beginning again, I would not allow this drift. I would act at once. There is also the principle of momentum. A small action taken immediately leads to another and another until movement becomes continuous. But if the first action is delayed, the chain is broken before it begins, and the man must start again. If I were beginning again, I would build momentum at once through immediate movement. There is also a transformation that occurs when the first hour is used with purpose. The man who acts early carries that action forward. He does not hesitate. Later, he does not struggle to begin, for he has already begun. If I were beginning again, I would recognize this advantage, for beginning once is easier than beginning repeatedly. There is also the effect upon thought. A man who begins his day with action thinks differently. He does not question himself unnecessarily. He proceeds. His thinking aligns with his movement, and in this alignment, effort becomes smoother. If I were beginning again, I would create this alignment early, before doubt appears. There is also the visible contrast. One man rises and delays, he moves slowly. He begins without urgency. His day reflects this. He continues in the same manner. Another rises and acts. He begins immediately. His day reflects this as well. He proceeds with greater speed, greater clarity, greater direction. If I were beginning again, I would become the latter through action. There is also the example of men who have understood this principle. Benjamin Franklin did not merely rise early. He directed his first hour. He asked himself what he would do. He acted accordingly. And in doing so, he established order. His day was not left to chance. It was structured from the beginning. If I were beginning again, I would follow this understanding. There is also the importance of simplicity. A man must not attempt to do many things at once. He must begin with one clear, definite, and act upon it. For the first action sets the tone. If I were beginning again, I would simplify this hour and strengthen it through clarity. There is also the compounding effect. Each morning of directed action builds upon the last. Momentum forms. It strengthens. It becomes expected. And, in time, it carries the man forward without effort. If I were beginning again, I would trust this accumulation, for it builds steadily, yet powerfully. There is also the removal of hesitation later in the day. A man who begins with delay must overcome resistance repeatedly. But a man who begins with action has already overcome it once, and this reduces future struggle. If I were beginning again, I would remove this repeated effort through early action. There is also the connection between the first hour and identity. A man who begins with purpose becomes one who acts with purpose. A man who begins without direction becomes one who drifts. This identity is formed daily through repetition. If I were beginning again, I would shape it deliberately through the first hour. There is also the perception of others. A man who moves with early momentum appears different. He does not seem rushed. He does not appear uncertain. He moves steadily. And in this he appears capable, reliable, directed. Others recognize this, and they respond accordingly. If I were beginning again, I would not seek to appear productive. I would become aligned through early action. There is also the transformation of effort. At first, the man must act deliberately. He must remind himself. He must apply attention. But with repetition, this changes. The first hour becomes natural, expected, and when it becomes expected, it becomes powerful. If I were beginning again, I would continue until this stage is reached. There is also a final realization. The day is not won through many actions, it is won through the first, for the first determines the rest. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, begin at once and continue. Let this be fixed firmly within. I begin with purpose. I act immediately. I build momentum without delay. Repeat this not as encouragement, but as method. For the mind, when trained to begin early, reduces resistance. And when resistance is reduced, action continues. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, having broken the comfort reflex, I would do this next. I would use the first hour fully, deliberately, without waste, until what begins as effort becomes momentum. And what becomes momentum carries me forward through the day without interruption and with increasing strength as I act, not occasionally, but continuously. From the very first moment I rise, having established momentum in the first hour, the next principle, if I were to begin again, is to understand that repeated action does not merely produce result, it produces identity. A man does not remain what he was when he begins. He becomes what he repeatedly does. And what he repeatedly does, especially in the quiet hours when no one observes, forms the image he holds of himself. If I were beginning again, I would not aim only to act differently. I would aim to become different. For identity governs action without effort. There is a distinction that must be understood. A man may wake early once, twice, even several times. Yet if he does not continue, he does not change. He has performed an action, but he has not formed a pattern. And without pattern, identity remains unchanged. If I were beginning again, I would not rely upon occasional effort. I would rely upon repetition, for repetition builds permanence. There is also the gradual nature of identity. It does not announce itself. A man does not say, I have become disciplined. He simply begins to act in accordance with it. He rises without question. He proceeds without hesitation. And in time, he no longer considers himself as one who struggles. He sees himself as one who acts. If I were beginning again, I would continue until this stage is reached. There is also the connection between repetition and belief. Each time a man follows through, he strengthens his belief in himself. He proves that his decision carries weight, that his command is obeyed, and in this, self-trust grows. If I were beginning again, I would build this trust deliberately through consistent action. There is also the removal of internal conflict. At first, a man may question himself. He may feel resistance. He may hesitate. But as repetition continues, this conflict weakens. The mind no longer argues. It accepts.